Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Highway 64 podcast from Murphy to Manteo. The Highway 64 project is a collaboration between Elon University's Professional Writing and Rhetoric program and the Environmental Studies Department to explore the local intricacies of culture, community, and climate resiliency along Highway 64 in North Carolina. Highway 64, running from the mountains to the ocean, is our North Carolina Heritage Highway and serves as a metaphor that represents the rich geographical, cultural, and ecological diversity that is our state. My name is Olivia Love, and I'm the producer of the podcast and a researcher on our team. Our guest for today is Dr. Emma Moesswilde, an environmental historian and professor here at Elon University, who teaches about the past and present changes in our natural world. Today's conversation will focus on how the environment and our relationship to nature has changed throughout time. With me today as well is Caden Hallberg and Dr. Michael Strickland, but I'll let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, hello. I'm Caden Hallberg, and I've been working on this project since my sophomore year at Elon University, and I'm going to be graduating in a few days, so this might be my last podcast, but yeah, and I'm actually in Dr. Moesswilde's one of her classes right now, so this will be very fun to talk about what I'm already learning about and get even more insight into the things that we've kind of overlooked.
And I'm Michael Strickland in the Environmental Studies Department. I also teach in Professional Writing and Rhetoric, and I'm the director of the Environmental Studies Center at Elon University, and I'm the founder of the Highway 64 project, which Olivia and Caden have been working with me on for a while now. So our guest today is Dr. Emma Moesswilde, one of my newest colleagues here at Elon, who I was very excited to have come on board. She's an environmental historian, and I guess we'll let her tell us a little bit about the research and teaching that she does.
Great. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. My name is Emma Moesswilde. I am a first-year assistant professor of history here at Elon. I'm an environmental historian, which means that I look at the relationships between humans and the more than human world in the past, and the relationship between the past and the present when we think about the natural world and our place within it. I hold a PhD and a master's degree in history from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in history and environmental studies from Bowdoin College.
Awesome. So I wanted to start us off by asking what first sparked your passion for environmental history.
Yeah. So my very first day of college, I had enrolled sort of on a spur of the moment in Introduction to Environmental Studies, and that was a team-taught course at Bowdoin, taught by John Lichter, who's now emeritus. He's an ecologist, and Matt Klingel, who is now the chair of the Environmental Studies department at Bowdoin. He's an environmental historian. And I remember those first couple of weeks of college where, of course, we all know those are some crazy weeks, some busy weeks. But I remember just feeling like, oh, you can study this environmental change in the past? And it just kind of blew my mind from day one. After deciding to major in environmental studies, Bowdoin actually requires you to do what's called a coordinate major, so a double major, in order to get breadth as well as depth in your environmental studies research. So I did that, and I was a coordinate major in environmental studies and history, and was able to complete undergraduate research I studied abroad in Scotland, and also was able to do an independent study on European environmental history with Megan Roberts, who's now the chair of the history department at Bowdoin. So by the time I had finished college, I was kind of a committed card-carrying environmental historian and didn't want my research and my interest in environmental history to stop there. So I decided to pursue a PhD, and here we are.
That's amazing. As a follow-up, environmental history seems to push beyond the idea that nature is something separate from humans. How would you define environmental history compared to something like traditional history or even environmental science?
Yeah. So like I said, environmental history is really about the relationships between humans and the more than human world. Generally, history focuses on people, right? People when they're born, when they died, what they did, various dates that you may or may not remember from high school. And environmental history extends the borders of what we look at as historical actors, what kinds of historical change um, matters when we think about the past, and how the relationships between humans and the more than human world have changed history, shaped these historical processes, again, that you may or may not remember from high school. That is how I would define environmental history. I want to say that there are lots of people who might not identify as environmental historians, right, who are still doing work that falls within what we might think of as environmental history, as I've defined it. So there are plenty of anthropologists, folks working across the academy and beyond who ask these kinds of questions, and that includes environmental scientists. So there's a lot of potential for collaboration in environmental history, which I really like, between historians and scientists, between historians and other folks from the humanities and the arts. Historical context and contingency takes into account the temperature of ocean water as much as it does the decision that a particular like military leader makes on a given day, right? And so that's what environmental historians are trying to do. And in order to do that work effectively, I think environmental historians need to be talking with folks from all of the other academic disciplines.
Yeah, and this is something we've talked about in our class. There's so many people with so many majors and backgrounds in my class. And, even though I am currently minoring in environmental studies, I wasn't familiar with the term environmental history when I came into the class. But, the more we talk about things and how different topics and themes and ideas connect to one another, I kind of began to understand that even though I hadn't necessarily ever used the term, I guess, environmental history, I'd still learned about a lot of these ideas in other classes, but just not connected them in the ways that we're connecting them right now. But I think a bunch of topics and a bunch of the research you've done and the areas that you're most familiar with, especially like agriculture and food and animals, if we're going to dive a little deeper into the idea of environmental history, how do you think these topics have an impact on any empire, really, on their environmental history, and how do they reveal the way that a society or an empire controls nature?
Yeah. I think one of the sort of starting points for environmental history is this idea that humans have always shaped the natural world. Humans changing the natural world is not by any means a modern phenomenon. A landscape is something that has been shaped, that humans have shaped, and that other beings have shaped as well. So humans aren't separate from the rest of things on Earth, for lack of a better term. I try to be as capacious in my language, right, as possible. Um, and so when we think about, I focus particularly on histories of climate change, of agriculture, of food, and also the role of gender in those types of environmental history. And what that comes down to often is looking at questions of power, right? Looking at power as a central component of the relationships between humans and the natural world over time. And so when we look at empire as a process, empire with a lowercase e is something that we've talked a lot about in my class this semester. Empire as a process is really about shifting power dynamics that shape human lives, human civilizations, and the natural world. So it's the natural world, the humans who live with us and the who live with it, and the relationship between the two. So this has to do with like the materiality of controlling nature in different imperial contexts, whether we're talking about disease control in the Byzantine Empire, or whether we're talking about mining for critical minerals in the 21st century. These are both questions of that really center on the relationship between the natural world, the process of empire, and the people who are impacted by that process in different ways. Um, a lot of the control also comes from different ways that people understand the natural world. And so another element of environmental history that I find really interesting is the history of environmental ideas, like how have people understood the natural world and their relationship with it over time. And knowledge, the relationship between knowledge and control plays a really significant role in a lot of environmental histories of imperial processes. One example that I like to use is I look at recipes in my research to understand how women, often as the cooks for their household, used food preparation as a way to respond to environmental change or to um, shape their family's relationship with environmental change and the natural world around them. Um, there is an estate in England which holds its papers at the National Archive in Kew, which is just outside of London. And when I was looking through these recipe papers, or when I was looking through these papers, I encountered a couple of different recipes. One of them was a recipe for feeding the poor in a time of scarcity. So this is a recipe intended to create like a modular stew or soup effectively. This is a recipe intended to create this modular soup or stew that can be made with different types of seasonal vegetables, with really hardy and cold resistant crops like barley. And that is basically a food that's created in order to feed laborers in a time of environmental or social crisis, some kind of food scarcity or lack of food availability. Um, so that's kind of one way to look at the relationship between food and power, like who has the power to create these massive vats of food and who is then receiving effectively food aid, right? Um, but then in that same packet of recipes, there's a recipe for pineapple cake because the same family also has a plantation in the Caribbean. And I believe the mother, um, so the recipes are collected by a woman named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's mother was born in the Caribbean, where her father had a plantation. And she brought back this pineapple recipe, which her daughter then saved in the same folder with this food scarcity. Who's growing these pineapples? Enslaved people, most likely. Who's eating this pineapple cake? People who enslave other human beings who are growing sugar. And I think that process of power dynamics, the relationship between the environments where these different foods grow, the environments where different people are working in free or coerced settings, that to me kind of encapsulates the whole range that you were getting at in your question, Kaden.
Geologists especially think in terms of deep time,
Mm-hmm.
expanses of time that the rest of us have a hard time grasping. Uh, So when we read about climate change issues and facts like the Earth is heading into a period now that will be hotter than any other time since our entire genus evolved, that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around. Then you say, okay, well, it's going to be hotter than any other time since our species, since sapiens sapiens evolved. Yeah, that's still hard for us to wrap our mind around. But I think you deal in time periods that the rest of us can make an intimate connection with. So we're wondering if you could tell us one or two. I mean, that's a really good anecdote about uh, the relationship between climate differences and power dynamics. But if there are a couple of other things that you've studied that will help get across to our audience about the potential impacts of climate change, because these things have been cyclical in the past, and I know
Mm-hmm.
you study those kinds of things. So if you could, and we don't hear about those in normal discourse, those historical disruptions, the little ice age and things like that. So what if you could just dig into that as a historian for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So The climate period that I look at, the period of history that I look at, is commonly referred to as the Little Ice Age. It, in its broadest sense, it lasted from about 1300 to about 1800. Um, and this is a significant period of global climate variability caused by natural factors, so not caused by human activity. There are a number of elements of the Earth's climate system that are variable during this time. Some of this is caused by volcanic eruptions. Some of it is caused by natural variabilities in the Earth's position in relation to the sun, which then impacts how much solar energy can reach Earth's surface. I could, and I do, go on for entire semesters about the history of the Little Ice Age, but just so everyone is roughly on the same page, that's a period of time that I look at. And in Europe, particularly, I study the British Isles and the broader Atlantic world, including parts of early America. In this time and place that I study, we have a great deal of information from written sources, from climate reconstruction data on past climates produced by climate scientists, going back to talking about collaboration earlier. Um, and so I'm able, using this wealth of data, to look at how small scale communities responded to natural climate variability for the British Isles in the Little Ice Age. This is mostly characterized by unpredictable weather patterns. So just more variable temperature and precipitation patterns. There are also periods of drought and colder than average temperatures, although any climate scientist will tell you that this is very regionally variable. So that's why I tend to look at a more local scale. There have been plenty of studies of societal scale climate impacts. I think those tend to flatten a lot of the variety in community scale responses, which is, again, what people can relate to when you're asking how did people in the past experience climate change. Um, so what I've found in my research is that people respond to climate change um, differently based on their positionality, the amount of power that they have, their identities. There are diaries and letters that I've looked at that primarily talk about the role of unpredictable weather in shaping the ways in which they are and are not able to visit their families in the Scottish Highlands, where travel in the 18th century is very difficult and is compounded by extreme weather conditions. There's a diary entry from a woman named Anna Green Winslow, the early 19th century, where she says, no, that's a lie. There's a diary entry from a woman named Anna Green Winslow in the second half of the 18th century. She's in Massachusetts, and she writes in February in the 1780s that it was so cold that she had to bring her children with her into the parlor. So her childcare schedule is disrupted for the day. And this is unique enough that she remarks on it. So her daughters can practice their sewing somewhere that's warm enough, right? And those kinds of everyday details about how people respond to the more quotidian aspects, the more everyday aspects of what we know is a period of global climate variability are really what capture my imagination. And so what I see is a lot of community level resilience, especially in rural communities where a certain amount of flexibility is kind of baked into a rural labor system. But I also see that especially in rural communities, when they are, what do I want to say here? Especially in rural communities which are lacking in power or are somehow oppressed by a faraway monarch or a faraway landlord, for instance, there's only so much that you can do in a community setting to respond to, for instance, global grain price fluctuations or the impetus of your landlord to make as much money as possible. So it's really not a linear narrative at any point in history of crisis or resilience, much as some airport bestsellers might want to convince you otherwise. And so I think that's why these community level histories, especially if there are enough of them, right, can present what I think is a really rich patchwork of history um, and responses to climate change in the past, in the Little Ice Age, but also in the deeper past and in more recent periods of history as well.
Yeah, and like connecting back to the power dynamics that we've talked about earlier, I have noticed a common theme that's really prevalent in environmental history.
Mhm.
And Cadence mentioned to me that in your class you've covered topics like capitalism, and I
Mhm.
wanted to ask if you can explain to our listeners who might not be as well versed in how capitalism impacts environmental studies and what the most important aspects of that relationship are.
Yeah. It's such an important question, and I think it's appeared to be of particular interest to the students this semester as well, which I confess I wasn't really expecting, but we've had some really fun conversations about it. So in our class this semester, we've read about different kinds of global economic systems and the relationship of capitalism and Western imperialism in the really from the 16th century onward, really from the 15th century onward. And a lot of this has to do with changing ideas of value in the natural world. So we read case studies on whales and walruses in the Bering Strait. That's a wonderful book called Floating Coast by Bathsheba Demuth, who's an environmental historian at Brown. We read some work by my former colleague at Georgetown, Tariq Ali, talking about the global jute trade, jute being the fiber that's cultivated to make sex, which everything then gets transported around the world in the 19th century. We've read also about the global fertilizer industry in the 19th and 20th century, especially work by Greg Cushman. And a lot of it, again, has to do with changing ideas of what is valuable, what is worth cultivating, often as a monoculture, which has really significant environmental impacts as well as really significant human impacts on generally coerced laborers who work in these monocultures. Um, so those are some of the hallmarks of the environmental dimensions of capitalism are these natural resources, the which are commodified and then coerced labor in monocultural settings. This is linked to these ideas of extractivism and endless growth, which are kind of foundational, not kind of, they are foundational to capitalism and capitalism's relationship with different processes of empire, and really a lack of circularity within an ecosystem and with a broader human system as well. And so one of the things that I like to emphasize in my teaching and in my work is that this lack of circularity um, or this idea that extractivism can somehow be linear is a capitalist fiction. And the past has showed us that time and time again. And so if you're trying to figure out, what can you do in your everyday life to respond to the climate crisis, to various environmental issues, to fight for environmental justice, I think focusing on circularity rather than extractivism, focusing on reciprocity rather than endless growth, is a great place to start. And that's also, I think, where you can start to parse some of the more recent um, capitalist efforts at environmentalism, which might appear appear greener, I think, at first blush than they actually are.
Yeah, well, a lot of what we've talked about in class and on the podcast, we've kind of hinted at this a little bit, but we've primarily been just talking about the past and how, of course, when we talk about the past, we want to be able to learn from the past so that in the present day and the future, we don't make those same mistakes, or we can try and, if we are going to go down a similar path, we can try and do something that is going to benefit the human, the empire, rather than um, harm some part of that empire. And we were kind of also talking about how society and empire just constantly is expanding and trying to uh, reach new areas in that empire or in the world. Uh, I guess for the future, we're constantly talking about where else we can expand, and outer space is one of those places that potentially humans could try and expand to. Um, and so I guess we're going to kind of talk about that in class. But before we get there, how do you think conversations around space exploration or trying to have humanity expand into space, what can we learn from the past um, before, like as we are discussing the role that outer space could have in the future?
So there are a lot of people talking about space. I got extremely focused on Artemis 2 just a few weeks ago, and I think this is something that's going to continue to really be in the zeitgeist, in the conversation. I think the most important thing as we continue to think about space exploration is that every time, and the wonderful astronauts who just returned to Earth, every time someone leaves Earth, they come back and they're like, oh, there's only one of these. Like, this is a really cool and unique place. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who's a wonderful climate writer and marine biologist, and Kate Marvel, who's a climate scientist, say Earth is the best planet. And like, kind of, yeah, right? So, highlighting, I think if space exploration can help us recognize and act on the fact that Earth is unique and special and really worth protecting, then that's a wonderful consequence of continued conversations about space exploration. I really hope that history does not repeat itself when we think about space as a quote unquote new frontier, right? I think we don't have a very good model for thinking equitably, justly, sustainably about new frontiers. So maybe we could scrap that as a way to think about outer space, right? We don't want to recreate inequalities in space, nor, I think, does history suggest that we should perpetuate inequalities on Earth in order to succeed in space exploration. There is this idea of limited growth in some space exploration circles. But I think thinking about space is also a great way to think about Earth itself and to reconnect with our place here on Earth and our place within the broader cosmos. And I do want to shout out my friend and colleague Dagmar de Groot's book, which is the first environmental history of space, which came out last year, where he talks also about the role of kind of space in the broader way that humans have understood Earth's environment and environments beyond Earth. So I think this is a conversation we're going to be having for a long time.
Emma, that's a very refreshing take on space exploration. I really appreciate that. As a person whose worldview was shaped pretty heavily as a young man by the original Star Trek series,
Mm,
I am a big proponent of space exploration and think about that kind of thing a lot, but I'm very skeptical about the way we go
hmm
about it when we're just looking
Sure.
for more ways to dominate uh, and replicate the mistakes we've already made. And when you look at the amount of money going into the research, what could we be doing here at home to make this planet better? But I
Sure.
think your take on it is very refreshing one. Just recently, I had my students read a recent piece in the by David Wallace Wells, and I think you and I have talked about this before. We kind of agree that
Mm,
he's a bit of a doomsayer, and if you
mhm,
read too much of him, you're going to get really depressed. But I do think he can be quite informative. This latest
mhm,
piece was about what most climate scientists are now predicting is going to be a super duper El Nino coming this summer, probably.
mm, mhm,
Uh, and speculating about what the impacts of that might be. And yes, uh, El Nino is a cyclical weather pattern that's been going on. We've been documenting it for hundreds of years. But I think we're only recently learning how the transfer of heat from the Central Pacific uh, and the shifting of the trade winds with these El Nino, La Nina cycles impacts weather all around the globe. And I know uh, in terms of environmental history, there's some interesting studies of how famines in the past that we know about, and even plagues and things like that, were
mhm.
probably indirectly or directly impacted by El Nino. Of course, it's hard to tell if we're underestimating or overestimating what this might be. But I was wondering if
Yeah.
you had any perspective on this as a historian about what we might be looking for, preparing ourselves to pay attention to as we head into this new climate variability section.
Yeah. I was glad that you shared this piece because it reminded me, of course, of Mike Davis's wonderful book, Late Victorian Holocausts,
Right.
which now I think I should put in the next iteration of this course syllabus. It's a great one. And yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to me is really thinking about who is going to be disproportionately impacted.
Mhm.
Is it going to be farmers who are going to be dealing with unprecedented extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation? And in the United States, those farmers have less and less protection and fewer federal and state resources available to them to cope with these kinds of changes. Folks living in areas vulnerable to sea level rise, folks living in the Pacific Islands, especially. Um, Other people who don't have as much of a safety net when they experience any kind of disaster. I think that is, I'm looking at this article now, and David Wallace Wells's sort of subtitle here is we're about to find out how prepared we are for climate change. And there are so many people, and not everyone is prepared for climate change in the same way. And I think Mike Davis's work on famines in the global south, particularly in India and in South Asia, really makes that clear, that these impacts will be felt disproportionately by people who do not have a safety net to cope with them. And I think climate justice and climate action looks like making sure that not only are we mitigating climate change as much as possible by reducing emissions, but we're also making sure that resilience is created equitably, right? So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. The other element that I think is important is a just society is a resilient society. It's not a coincidence that these El Nino famines in the 19th century, that other episodes of significant atmospheric circulation change and cyclical weather events, often those impacts are felt disproportionately by people who are already living with some kind of inequality. So there's a reason that Ulysses S. Grant has to leave the United States to witness that type of famine. Not that there's not rampant inequality in the United States right after the Civil War, but those impacts are disproportionately felt by folks under the British Empire. So I think as we consider what resilience to an extreme El Nino might look like, we should be thinking about community scale response, about reciprocity, and about what other types of justice systems, which aren't necessarily um, climate flavored or climate themed at first blush, but are really important to ensure that when things go south, no pun intended, folks are able to take care of themselves and take care of each other.
Yeah, I had someone say to me that everyone is impacted by climate change. You just might not have connected the dots to how you're impacted yet. And I think it's really important to realize how many people are impacted every day. So, thank you so much, Emma, for taking the time to hop on today and chat with not only us, but the rest of the Elon community about the importance of understanding the relationship we have with the environment throughout history and the many ways in which we influence that history. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and always feel free to leave us an email with any feedback. Thank you very much.